Okay, so we've started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the National Weather Association's November webinar. My name is Melissa Sizemore, and I'm with the National Weather Association webinar team. Before I kick it over to Todd Laricos, National Weather Association President, and today's host, I would like to go over some logistics. Everyone will be kept on mute for the entirety of the talk, but you can ask questions throughout the webinar by either using the question feature on the GoToWebinar graphical user interface, or you can ask your question on Twitter by using the hashtag NWAWebinar. I will then read the questions at the end of the presentation during the moderated panel. You can follow along and also participate in the discussion on Twitter using the same hashtag NWAWebinar, or follow the NWA account at NWAS on Twitter. Lastly, this webinar is being recorded for later viewing on our YouTube channel. Now that general logistics are covered, over to you, Todd.
Okay, thank you, Melissa. Looks like I'm unmuted. And thank all of you for attending this month's NWA webinar series. The webinar series was begun a while back and represents a great value to our membership. We use it as a vehicle to kind of stay abreast of all the things that are happening within our respective career fields and our association. It helps us serve our customers and the general public better by continuing our education. And it's a fantastic vehicle for that sort of thing. And I encourage you all to put it on your calendar each month and attend as you see issues and subjects that come up that interest you, and take advantage of the tremendous opportunity that Melissa and the team provide every month. It wasn't long ago, right after our annual meeting, when the NWA webinar team came to me and asked if I could highlight a specific number of poster presentations from our annual meeting. Poster presentations has kind of taken on a different meaning these days, particularly in our virtual environment. We saw all sorts of different presentation platforms in those poster sessions. So when I use the term poster, I'm using it very broadly, of course. But I was asked by the webinar team to kind of highlight 3 specifically that could be ported over to an NWA webinar and maybe provide a little bit more focus on the particular activity that our members are doing. And in so doing that, I went through, and I had my personal notes from the annual meeting, of course, but I went back through and I viewed a lot of the poster presentations that I didn't get to see. And I felt that I picked these 3 that you're going to see today because they represent a broad cross-section of our entire membership within our association and the activities that we are involved in all facets of meteorology and related fields. And so it's with that in mind that we provided this platform for these 4 individuals. And I hope you enjoy this as they go through and they present in a little bit more detailed manner what they were able to present as a poster in the annual meeting. So I'll get right to it and not waste too much time. The first presentation up is going to be Chris Bagaski, who had a presentation that I felt was rather interesting. It's called One Strike You're Out, a preliminary look at lightning surrounding MLB stadiums. And I chose this one largely because Chris comes from the private sector. And this is a topic that I think affects all of the sectors within the NWA, which is lightning safety and support to events. It even has some repercussions into emergency management, even observations and all the things that we're involved in. And so Chris is going to talk specifically about his work that he's done with this, but feel free to jot down your questions and I'm sure he'll answer them. So without further ado, I will pass it off to Chris. The floor is yours, sir.
Okay, well, thank you, Todd, and thank you to the National Weather Association for giving me this opportunity to share this work that I've done. It's kind of a labor of love. I was talking to somebody about just what went into collecting all of this data, and it was about 1 hour for each of the 30 different teams around the baseball league. So 30 hours of collecting just lightning data and then doing the different analysis and things like that. Beautiful sunny day at Coors Field back when baseball used to allow fans in the stadium, and hopefully next year or the year after that we'll be able to go back out to the ballpark. But quick introduction, my name is Chris Bagaski. I'm a Lightning Applications Manager at Vizsla. I'm a Lightning Safety and Lightning Data Specialist with the National Lightning Safety Council. So as I kind of alluded to, I went through and looked at lightning data surrounding each of the 30 MLB home stadiums over the past few years to get an idea of the implications on lightning safety around baseball games. And you can go back over 100 years to when Ray Caldwell was pitching in the 9th inning in Cleveland, Ohio, and he was struck by lightning on the mound. He quickly recovered, and finished the game. But it kind of addressed a need, over 100 years ago, that lightning in these games that take place primarily outdoors could be a significant risk, especially when you have millions of fans attending games every year. You fast forward over 100 years, and you have a game that was the first game back after COVID restrictions, Nationals ballpark in Washington, D.C., where there was a significant amount of lightning surrounding the stadium and even overhead before the game was delayed. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in some coming slides. But when you think about it, the official Major League Baseball rulebook includes the phrase lightning safety for the first time just last year. And that is over 100 years after a player was struck, and fortunately well enough to be able to finish the game. But when you think about that, you have 100 years of baseball after somebody was struck by lightning before they include the phrase lightning safety in the rule book. And even though lightning safety is in the rule book, you have a game where 3,000 lightning events are within 8 miles of a ballpark before a game is delayed. So there still is this big potential risk to safety of fans, of the players, of the grounds crew, and everybody at the games due to lightning. And these are the two rules that I mentioned where lightning safety is now included in the rule book, 403E and 404A. And they relate to when a game can be suspended. And typically it's the umpire who has that ability to call a game based on weather after the game has started, unless you have this policy for severe weather or lightning safety that's been filed with the league before the championship season begins. So based on these two rules now, if a team has filed a lightning safety plan or severe weather plan with the commissioner's office, then you can delay a game due to lightning without relying on the umpire. And umpires have a lot going on during the game, calling balls and strikes, outs, making sure the game is being played properly, that they're not necessarily thinking about what is the weather doing until it starts really to rain on them. And that's where some of this issue with lightning safety comes in, because you're not looking to the sky to see, okay, I saw that lightning, all right, let me count 1, 2, 3. Oh, there's the thunder. It's too close. We need to delay a game. And I had mentioned this first game back after COVID restrictions, July 23rd. The Nationals were on national TV. It was a big game, a lot of viewership, because we're trying to get back to normal after everything that had happened in the first half of 2020. All of the dots that you see on the map here, the black dots are in cloud lightning. The red squares are cloud to ground lightning. The lightning that occurred from 30 minutes before the baseball game was delayed until the time that the game was delayed. And there's more than 3,000 lightning events that were within 8 miles of Nationals ballpark. And that 8-mile range is kind of a lightning safety standard that is used in a lot of applications for when you need to start delaying activities and get people to safety. When you zoom in on Nationals Park, which is the blue diamond, you can see that there is a lot of black dots, within a mile or two of the ballpark. And this is lightning that was occurring directly overhead, even though the rain wasn't necessarily falling on the stadium at the time. So when you have lightning overhead, even if it's not coming to the ground, there still is that chance that lightning could hit the ground. So having lightning directly overhead, and you see the one detection directly over the ballpark, it poses a significant risk to the players, and if there were fans in the stadium, the fans, if you're not taking lightning safety precautions. I wanted to think, maybe this is just observational bias. We're seeing the games where there is lightning. We're seeing the teams show images of lightning near the ballparks through social media, through pictures, through videos. So maybe it's just, we're just seeing these events. People are calling attention to these events, so we're paying attention to them, and maybe it's not as big a deal as we think it is. So luckily we have lightning detection. There's ground-based networks, there's the satellites that are doing lightning detection real time, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. So we can actually go back and look at the data to see, is there actually a big lightning safety risk associated with these baseball games? So I briefly mentioned this at the beginning. I looked at National Lightning Detection Network in cloud and cloud-to-ground lightning within 8 miles of MLB ballparks. It took me, an hour to an hour and a half per team to look at these. So it was no small feat to get the time that the game started, the time that the game ended, and then look at the data of lightning for that time period, including an hour before and an hour after the game. I included those extra 2 hours to account for time when fans would be entering or leaving the ballpark before or after the games. And I looked at all games from 2016 to 2019. So that gave us about 10,000 games to look at. So it was a very large data set that we ended up looking at. To quickly summarize, 27 of the 30 stadiums had lightning within 8 miles. Perhaps no surprise, the only stadiums that didn't have lightning were Dodger Stadium in Los Angeles, Petco Park in San Diego, and the Oakland Coliseum. On the West Coast, typically have a lot less lightning than further east. There were over 175,000 total lightning events that were detected within 8 miles of the ballparks by the National Lightning Detection Network. Almost 50,000 of them were cloud-to-ground strokes, and each cloud-to-ground stroke is a potential for somebody to get struck. And 2,700 of them were within a mile of the ballpark. 715 games in those 4 years had lightning within 8 miles. That's almost 180 games per year. So a typical baseball season is 162 games per team. That's another way of thinking of that is for each time that every team plays on a single day. So each time you have 15 games, one of those games has the potential to have lightning in it. That's what the numbers average out to. So it is a pretty significant lightning risk when you're playing baseball. It's not baseball unless you're looking at standings here. So if you take a look at the standings here, the Houston Astros were the winners with the number of lightning events at over 24,000 lightning events within 8 miles of the ballpark. But the Marlins actually had the most games where lightning was within 8 miles. Almost a quarter of their games at Marlins Park, 80 of them, had lightning within 8 miles. So pick your favorite team, and then you can see the data there. It's not an insignificant threat to the millions of fans and the professional players when you're playing a 162 game season in the middle of the peak lightning season in the United States. So what do we do? Well, there's the Storm Ready program with the National Weather Service, and there are 8 teams that are all storm ready, including the Cardinals, the Rockies, the Indians, and the White Sox. But maybe every other team, the other 22 teams, should take a look at getting storm ready. And part of getting storm ready is having that weather safety plan. And once you have that plan, you can submit that to the league office and delay the game if lightning is within the area. Perhaps it's time to review and revamp the lightning safety toolkit. And I've proposed that the National Lightning Safety Council begins a review of what's in the lightning safety toolkit and see if there's anything that we can do to make that better for professional baseball and professional sports leagues as a whole. And a goal, I think, is a really good goal for the weather community is to have all teams with this hazardous weather lightning safety plan in place with the league office so that they can delay a game if lightning is in the area and you're not having to rely on the umpires. So to quickly wrap up, over 175,000 lightning events were within 8 miles of ballparks between 2016 and 2019. That's 179 games. It's about 7 to 8% of all the games in that time period, or for each day that every baseball team plays, one of those games could have lightning. And a lightning safety plan would allow the baseball teams to delay a game for lightning without waiting on the umpire to call the game, typically once it starts raining. If you have any questions, I'm happy to take them towards the end of this webinar, or if you think of anything later, you can always send me an email and we'll be happy to speak more about this. So thanks again for allowing me to present this, and I'll hand it back over.
Okay, thank you, Chris. I will pass it over to Melissa if there are any questions.
We had one question on Twitter. Hey, Chris, do you plan on expanding your study to include other sports and or various large-scale stadium/festival events? That would be interesting to see. Thanks.
Yeah, and colleagues of mine on the National Lightning Safety Council, Ron Hawley and Katie Flanagan, have actually looked at lightning impacts on college football games. They presented that at the International Lightning Detection and Lightning Meteorology Conference a couple of years ago. So if you go to Vizsla.com/ILDC, their paper on that is posted online.
Perfect. Okay, Todd, do you want to throw it over to the next presentation?
Okay, hopefully everybody can hear me. It looks like I'm having a little bit of technical trouble here, but I'll just push forward like everybody can hear me. I hope they can. So our next presentation is from two of our emergency management members, and it's behind the curtain. I like the Wizard of Oz references there. Suburban and rural decision making and emergency management. So I will turn it over to two wizards of emergency management here, Ashley Morris and Felix Nance. So go ahead and take it away, folks. Thanks.
All right, great. First of all, I want to thank you guys for being here. Thank you for giving us the time. We're absolutely excited to be able to talk more about emergency management and decision making. And so the really key takeaway of why we're doing this presentation is to give some insight about emergency management decision making, and really to emphasize the fact that emergency management decision making is not equivalent in every jurisdiction. A suburban jurisdiction does not have the same amount of resources as a rural one. And so when we're dealing with weather decisions or other things like that, there's a lot that comes into play when we're dealing with that. But before we can really talk about any kind of decision making that we're making during an incident or during severe weather, we want to actually touch on the community assessment process and actually understanding our community design. So emergency managers spend a lot of time looking at our community and what actually makes it our community, and in a unique way. And we do that through a ton of different kinds of hazard risk assessments, like a THIRA, hazard mitigation plans, and also local emergency operations plans. Within those plans and those assessments, we're always looking at different variables that are not only natural, but also man-made. Some examples include waterways, vegetation, terrain, climate, and then also weather. And then we're also looking at our actual physical layout of our city. So how our jurisdiction is built, where our fire departments are located and our hospitals, what are our community demographics, what are our economics, our politics, and also where are our people originally from? Do we have a lot of tourists? Those kinds of things. The key takeaway of this assessment process is the fact that this varies widely from city to city, county to county around the country. And so keep in mind that if we have such a variable jurisdiction process and so many different ones across the country, then the decision making is going to be different, even if we're faced with the same kind of severe weather setup as you might be across the country. And I'm going to go ahead and pass this over to Felix.
We have to look at a balanced process here. We have to talk about consequences of the actions that are about to happen or what may happen, the timing, which is incredibly important, and then we have to look at intelligence and resources. So let's break these down real quick. The consequences. A severe thunderstorm moving at 60 miles an hour versus a severe thunderstorm moving at 5 miles an hour give an entirely different time frame for arrival, which, as we talked about, timing and the consequences of moving people into or out of harm's way become an issue. Intelligence, well, we need to know where that storm is, where it's going, and where it's projected to go. And then our resources. What can we do to combat if we have lightning strikes that cause fires, power outages, flooding issues? All this gets stirred into the big pot and the big picture. Ashley?
All right, and there are several different factors and categories that actually influence when we're actually going to make a decision and what decisions we make. So those 4 categories include consequences, timing, intelligence, and resources. And the first one that we're looking at is if there's any kind of danger to lives, property, or the state of our community. If there's any kind of hazard that's coming our way that's going to do any of those things, obviously we're going to be taking action and making decisions to protect lives and save property. That's always number 1 in emergency management. We're also looking at the timing of the hazard, and this is really important because it's going to affect whether or not we have the resources and what decisions we're going to be able to make at the time. And so the duration of impacts, that's going to be actually the amount of time that you're being impacted by that storm or by that hazard. That's super important because we need to know if we have the manpower and the resources to handle that. And then also the start and end time. That's extremely important because we have a lot of things in emergency management that we have to take care of before the hazard setup actually occurs. Some examples of that are going to include setting up your EOC, getting your staff to the EOC because we don't want them driving through the middle of the hazard. Also getting first response callbacks for responders to set up for rescues and things like that. It takes them quite a bit of time to do overtime setups and actually get staffing done. So it's really nice to have that start and end time frame for the hazard. The third category is going to be intelligence. So when we're making decisions, we're constantly looking for updated forecasts that have the impacts and the certainty, public safety reports that are called into dispatch, community reports, often from social media, and also our information from our first responders out at the scene or out there working the incident. And then lastly, this is the most important, resources. And this is where we have an extreme amount of variance between jurisdiction to jurisdiction, especially if you're talking about rural emergency management and suburban emergency management. First of all, available resources. What do we have to use right now? How many people do we have to work? What kind of trucks or vehicles do we have to solve the problem? And then we're looking at plans and agreements. So after we kind of assess what resources we have as a jurisdiction, what agreements do we have with our neighbors to where we can call them and have them come and assist us with those resources? And then also what contracts do we have to call people in and have them assist with that. And then the last resource example would be outsource or outside resource availability. So that's going to be like our state resources and some of those other things. Keep in mind with resource availability that your resources can be extremely variable. So the resources that I have today might not be the same as what I have in 6 months. And so my decision-making process and the ability for me to carry out that decision, and then also the speed of my decision and actually doing the action might vary depending on what resources I actually have.
And those resources change from a rural to a urban perspective, because when you're dealing with volunteers, you may or may not have that many people.
Yes, and we're going to get into that to kind of wrap up this presentation. We wanted to produce a case study and kind of choose a scenario to go through to compare suburban and rural emergency management dealing with. And so our example is going to be a 4th of July bonanza, where we have fireworks, we have an outdoor festival, we have people gathering at these events. We have a wildfire risk because it's the summertime, so our vegetation is very dry. We also have some storms that are supposed to move through, ironically, during the peak time that all the events are outside with lightning and hail and all of those kinds of things. And then we have extreme heat risk. And so from a suburban emergency management perspective, we were really lucky in my previous jurisdiction to have paid fire staff. So all of our fire staff were career and all of our stations were staffed, same with police. And then we also had 2 full-time emergency managers. So we had the time and resources to be able to do pre-planning for this event. We would meet with our partners. We would discuss things like evacuations, like severe weather, like the lightning radius that we need to have to evacuate people out of the open field where the concert was. We put all of this on a paper plan, and we made everybody sign it and discussed how we would be communicating with each other with that. We decided to increase our staffing, especially in the fire department, to handle any additional fire calls or police calls. And then also in OEM, we actually decided to open up the EOC and lean forward to monitor the weather. We were actually the go-to weather monitors of the day, and we would coordinate with NWS. And the important thing about that is that we actually would tell NWS and NWS chat when we were opening. We would tell them the time of all of our events that we were watching, and we would also tell them those trigger points. So the lightning radius that we needed for that evacuation, the gust limit on the stage, because it was actually only set at like 35 miles an hour. And obviously that's below severe criteria. So I need them to be looking for sub-severe gusts for my event. And so we were doing that coordination within the EOC. But as meteorologists, all of us kind of tend to just think of the weather risk, right? We're kind of more worried about the lightning risk or the heat risk when we're looking at this scenario. But keep in mind that we're serving public safety. So there are a ton of other risks with fire and police and other public safety issues that we're going to have to solve. Some examples would be firework fires. Some of those could be brush fires, structure fires, domestic violence calls typically increased on that day. Also traffic from the event, as well as the everyday calls. Just because we're handling severe weather or it's a holiday doesn't mean that your cardiac arrest calls or your accident calls or your fall calls stop. So as an emergency manager, we are trying very hard to manage our resources and make those decisions related to weather, but we have to also keep in mind all of the other things from the broader perspective to make sure our resources can stretch to manage everyone's safety. And I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to Felix to wrap up rural.
And you know that works well in an urban setting. In a rural setting, dealing with volunteers, you're first of all have to find out who's actually around and going to be available. Then you have to start all the problems Ashley mentioned. You could also have to deal with events happening on the lake as well as adjacent to the lake. She talked about command and control decisions. Sometimes the EOC is not the room where everybody's meeting, but it's the tailgate of the pickup truck where you're at. It takes the ICS takes a little bit of massaging when you're in a rural setting, because your emergency operations center may in fact equal the incident command post at times. So it is an interesting scenario to deal with, and resources, people, and equipment are always key when you're dealing with public safety. So the planning process is important, It's a little different in a rural setting because you don't have all those people available readily to plan with. So your timing issues are changed somewhat. It makes it a bit of a challenge, but that's why we're all in for it. But that's also why we need the information to be able to pass that to the people that are having the event. One thing that is of note, a lot of the private events can't avail themselves directly from weather information from the National Weather Service. So it does create some issues for those type of events to have weather support, decision support. We appreciate the time to present our information because it is important. You have to know that it's not all about weather, it's all about humans, and sometimes they don't do what needs to be done when the weather changes, but to give them the right information, and hopefully we can steer them the right way and keep them safe, because that's what we're all in it for.
Yep. So with that, we want to thank you guys so much for listening. That was all the slides that we had. We had our Twitter information on the title, and you can contact us on Twitter or reach out to me in the chat. I could give you guys my email. But thank you guys for listening. I hope you got something insightful out of emergency management decision-making process.
Thanks very much.
And thank you both for that presentation. It was very interesting. It caught my eye during the NWA annual meeting. And, I think one of the things, I'll start off with a question, and Melissa and the crew might have more that are flowing in. But, I live this every day here in Vegas with a very big mix of rural versus urban EMs. And I guess my generic question is how valuable is the personal relationships that are established before an incident or a planned event in kind of designing these types of support that you describe here between urban and rural?
Extremely valuable. And if I had a little more time, I would like to touch on that. Really, emergency managers don't have the authority to shut down every event that goes on in our jurisdiction. Oftentimes, events are private. And so with a lot of these concerts and these festivals, they're the ones that actually pull the plug on the event. I can tell them, hey, weather's come in or whatever. And then if it's really bad, we could probably get away with it and be okay. But it's really important to sit down with them and build that relationship in the beginning. And that's what we do when we start that pre-planning phase. We do that event action plan with them. I kind of discuss with them how public safety works and the importance of having the evacuation, the wind threshold, the lightning threshold, and all of that. And then usually if you can establish that relationship, then they're going to probably listen to you and you guys are kind of buddies. And then you can shut down the event or what's done is done. But without that relationship, you can't count on them to make the decision if they're not really an expertise in that. And then Felix might have something. Go ahead.
The other side of that coin is the relationship you have with the Weather Service, because if you're working together with the Weather Service, you can find out their confidence level, and they can kind of steer you towards steer your thought processes into what's coming out. They can look at the radar and say, you need to really pay attention. You've got storms coming, but those storms are putting out a fine line or a gust front ahead of them that's going to reach you 30, 45 minutes before the storms do. You need to be sure and relay that information to your participants so they understand that. So it's a double-edged sword, and it's very sharp on both sides, both to have the relationship with the event people and with the Weather Service so that it makes a teamed approach. That's part of the integrated warning team.
Thank you both. I'll kick it over to Melissa to see if there are any questions that have flowed in.
As of right now, there are no other questions that have popped up. So what I ask is everybody think about some questions about Chris and Ashley and Felix's presentations that we can ask at the end. But as of right now, I'm going to kick it back to Todd.
Okay, thanks, Melissa. And next up is our third and final presentation. We have Mike Stoddenmeyer from Western Region, National Weather Service Western Region Headquarters, and he's going to talk a little bit about heat risk. I have a history with heat risk being out here in Western Region. It is the primary way in which we message heat impacts, and I think it's a very unique approach to a problem of communicating risk around heat itself, and that we're kind of breaking out of the old warning type of paradigm and learning that heat is actually a messaging hierarchy that begins well below that of advisories and warnings. And so Mike's here to explain a little bit more about that, and so I will turn it over to him.
Thanks, Todd. Just verifying that my screen's being shown.
Yep, you're good to go.
All right, excellent. All right, well, thanks everyone. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with everyone. My name is Mike Stoddenmeyer, and as Todd said, I'm with the National Weather Service Western Region Headquarters. I'm excited to speak about our multi-year effort developing a prototype heat service called Heat Risk. Before I get into the details, I want to recognize the other co-authors, and they're listed here, who were on the original poster presentation, and there's many other folks that were involved in the project, too many to mention right now. The National Weather Service Western Region Experimental Heat Risk is a framework where peer-reviewed heat health science has been applied nationally in a consistent way to identify unusual and potentially dangerous heat. We structured this to be like the Air Quality Index, which provides a simple color and numeric framework that's the service, and then we put in the science under the hood to drive the daily values. That way, when new heat health results are discovered, we can incorporate these new results into the existing framework and further improve the heat service. There we go. So Heat Risk puts forecast heat in the 7-day period into climatological context, and we do that using both the National Weather Service's official 2.5 kilometer resolution gridded forecast and the Centers for Disease Control's modeled heat health thresholds. Since this is a continuous national data set, there's no regional seams or forecast areas or zones that are visible. And the service also allows us to explore newer messaging capabilities beyond our traditional heat products. Because a forecast of heat risk is always available, customers and partners can take actions needed on their own timescale rather than having to interpret the 7-day temperature forecast themselves or wait for a legacy heat product to eventually be issued. While experimental, the feedback's been really positive, and the climatology of heat risk also provides us with a mechanism to work with decision makers to generate actionable historical risk probabilities. I'll talk a little bit more about this later. So here you can see all the factors that are considered in the heat risk approach. The big difference from traditional approaches are that both high and low temperatures play a role in predicting the 24-hour heat risk value. The thresholds change throughout the year based on local climatology, including using both a normal annual curve and the 95th percentile of temperatures to better account for acclimation. CDC heat health thresholds are used to inform us what temperatures are actually dangerous to humans, and the entire 7-day period is examined with duration automatically considered. Specific heat health science results that we built into the system include that the higher vulnerability of a population early in the heat season, that the general population can generally acclimate to the warming climate from spring to summer, while also recognizing that vulnerable populations do not have as strong of an acclimation response, along with having different thresholds for different climatologies, such as coastal versus inland locations and valleys versus mountains. We always get asked if we consider moisture in the process. While we don't specifically account for dew point temperatures, we leverage low temperatures, and we all know that low temperatures have a strong relationship to dew point temperatures. We leverage a station's climatology, which also reflects moist versus dry environments. And we also have a different 24-hour heat risk equation formulation that we use in locations that are climatologically humid. More specifically, we identify appropriate shoulder season values for yellow, orange, and red thresholds based on a combination of CDC heat health data and climatology. We then leverage the NCEI 1981 to 2010 normal daily high and low temperature curves and the 95th percentile of temperatures to generate the daily thresholds for yellow, orange, and red. I've shown an example here from the Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport in Arizona. If you follow the red and orange levels that start out on the left-hand side, if you look at the bottom of the charts, you see January through December. So this is an annual chart, and each of the lines go through kind of the calendar year with the various thresholds. So if you follow the red and orange levels, you see how the heat impact level thresholds increase during the spring, those little stair steps on there. That accounts for acclimation. They peak in the summer at this location prior to the monsoon season when all the clouds and moisture and rainfall climatologically start. And then they drop through the fall into the winter season. You can also see how the orange level plateaus at the shoulder red level values, and this accounts for the reduced acclimation that some at-risk populations will continue to experience throughout the entire year. As mentioned, we do this for all robust and reliable NCEI climate points for both max T and min T. And this provides us with over 4,000 points of unique data. The website here takes you to our historical data page where you can access these individual station plots along with the historical heat risk data. We take all these unique point-based thresholds and then we distribute them leveraging the Oregon State University's 800-meter resolution prism grids to generate daily max temperature and min temperature, red, orange, and yellow gridded thresholds. These gridded thresholds are then compared to the 7-day National Weather Service's gridded temperature forecasts, and that outlook is then combined using 24-hour heat risk equations. And as I mentioned before, we have one for climatologically humid locations and one for non-humid locations to generate an appropriate heat risk value at each grid point. The gridded daily value of heat risk is the end result of the process, and this is the service we provide to decision makers and the general public. All of these calculations happen within the National Weather Service's AWIP systems at each office, and we provide the final output in multiple formats in a web interface. This animation shows some of the functionality of the web page, including the fact that you can look at the full 7 days. You have the ability to sample points and see the official NDFD temperature forecast, along with the heat risk 24-hour values. There's zooming capabilities. You can zoom in right into your local address, neighborhood level. You can type in an address and it'll zoom into that location. There's information on the approach, background, also a table indicating the meaning of the levels and appropriate actions to take. This web page would essentially be the go-to source for the heat service, allowing our partners and customers to see the levels of heat risk for their areas of concern on the timeline that they want to do it. We, of course, would still work proactively and directly with certain partners who deal specifically with heat-related decisions, along with still issuing our legacy heat products. So we already know the challenges with collecting heat impact data and then trying to determine a threshold that works across different groups and sectors. This leads to one threshold kind of approach, and it really doesn't work that well. Heat really impacts people on at various levels. We'd like to suggest that with the heat risk framework, you can take the long-term climatology of past heat risk values at a station. You can correlate those to your partner's impact data, and then develop a historical impacts-based probabilistic risk profile specifically for that partner and their data that they can then use to make inferred decisions for the next heat event. So it's not perfect, but this approach has several advantages. While we'll continue to sort out better ways of collecting and attributing data like mortality and morbidity, this is a baby step towards customizing our output for that user. So in this example here, abbreviated example, we find that on red days in July, the data showed a 72% increase in admittance over the baseline, which allows that partner to staff appropriately for the next red level heat event. But they also know that on orange days, they've seen a 26% increase in admittance, and they can also staff appropriately for that next orange level heat event. Again, this isn't perfect, but it's a step towards providing historical probabilistic information regarding heat and the impacts from excessive heat. While querying our partners, we received many words of support for the project. Listed here are just a few of the benefits we heard about when talking directly with partners. The big screaming message is that decision makers have used this experimental service to augment the National Weather Service's legacy heat program by being able to anticipate dangerous heat further out in a forecast period, by identifying days where at-risk communities should take action even if the National Weather Service isn't going to provide a general heat advisory or warning, and they can leverage the ease of communicating and messaging the potential risk from heat with this color numeric system. So does it work? So here's an example from Maricopa County in Arizona. And remember, this is a really warm climate in an area where heat is very common. And it shows the 2020 heat-related normalized daily emergency room visit percentages as vertical bars. the daily 24-hour heat risk value as the shaded colors, the days with legacy heat products issued as stars, along with a side chart indicating the rising percentages of ER visits with increasing heat risk values over the entire heat season. This clearly shows that there's no one value that provides the best forecast, but that increasing risk and impacts were captured well at this location and year using this approach. It highlights that even in warm climates, heat impacts are a daily occurrence punctuated by more significant events. Having a forecast of daily heat risk available each day provides a valuable service for those partners who work with at-risk groups and in heat-sensitive sectors who experience impacts at thresholds below our legacy heat product levels. So in conclusion, heat risk takes into account various heat health science results, high-resolution climatology, and CDC-derived heat health thresholds, and puts it into a future-looking heat service. This service could be extended as far in the future as the forecast goes. It serves as a common starting point for a general approach to heat risk, allowing more time for appropriate messaging and decision support services. It allows for national consistency and a one event, one forecast approach. It also provides a way to derive actionable information with our partners. We've been using it here in the Western region of the US for several years now, including driving much of our legacy heat product issuances and our heat messaging approaches, and it seems to be really successful. We greatly appreciate the opportunity to present on the National Weather Service's Experimental Heat Risk Project. Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity.
Okay, Mike, thanks for that presentation. Melissa, were there any questions that rolled in?
Yes, I had one question from Mike from Katie Flanagan. Does heat risk just measure ambient heat, or does it account for humidity as well?
See, so like I said, we always get the question about humidity. Dew points are really tough. It's a much tougher weather element to forecast for, and we wanted something that you could apply across the board. In the West, humidity isn't a huge component of our heat impacts, and so short answer is we don't directly address humidity in our calculations or moisture, but as we know, low temperature has a 1-to-1 correlation with humidity. If it's a high dew point night, your low temperatures tend to be quite elevated. If there's cloud covers or wind, your low temperatures are depressed, but your low temperatures are boosted up. There's a great relationship between temperatures and humidity that we're leveraging along with a station's climatology and also the 24-hour equation that we use. And we feel that that gives us a pretty good proxy for humidity without having to get into the challenges of forecasting dew points out to 7 days.
Perfect. Why don't we welcome everybody back, and we can go ahead and ask. I have one question for Felix and Ashley, as well as go ahead if anybody has any questions for the group, drop it into the question box below, or go ahead and ask on Twitter at #NWA webinar. This first question that I have for Felix and Ashley is, what can the Weather Enterprise do to assist EM jurisdictions of all sizes, or what can they essentially further do to assist EM jurisdictions of all sizes?
You want to go, Felix?
Sure. Let's go to ladies go first. One of the key things we have to have is, you know, the basic knowledge of what is expected. And as Ashley pointed out earlier, subsevere thunderstorms still produce winds up to 58 miles an hour and still produce lightning and still produce small hail. It's very important to know that if you've got a group camped out, a scout group camped out somewhere in tents, a 50-mile-an-hour wind with pea-size hail is still as important to them as a 100-mile-an-hour rotating wind in town. It still produces damage, blows away tents. So there's a lot of, you know, Sub-severe weather is still important. That's one of the keys, and knowing what's happening in your community or where you're looking at where your activities are, because it changes from activity to activity. We don't have the 100,000 people in the stands like they do at Norman for a football game, but I guarantee you, on a Friday night, there are people all over the country at Friday night lights and football games in small communities, and lightning and wind do have an impact. So that kind of information being communicated down to us from the weather enterprise allows us to distribute that information to those decision makers in the field.
Yeah, and I can add a little bit. I think just building relationships, like we kind of tried to emphasize earlier. So there are a lot of emergency managers, especially rural, but all over the country, that don't even know very much at all about NWS, about the services that they provide, about the fact that they can have an NWS chat account and they can have 24/7 access to the office that easy for free. And so just reaching out to all of the emergency managers in your CWA, or if you're private sector, wherever you work, and kind of establishing relationships, making that partnership, being a friend, I think honestly is kind of the biggest goal on how to kind of progress emergency management and weather decision making.
Good deal. I also have another question for Felix and Ashley. What is the interface like when a more urban community and a rural community must collaborate or work together? What are some of the main obstacles?
I can start with this one first. So really the main obstacles, I guess, once you can actually get to the table, because it's kind of challenging to get in a room together, especially with rural emergency managers who have a lot on their plate. Usually you're looking at someone who's part-time, or there's only one person there, and so they're doing all emergency management by themselves on top of other responsibilities. And so just figuring out a time to collaborate with them is kind of a challenge, but once you actually establish that relationship again too, you can start to kind of pair up, make plans together, share resources. I think honestly, the emphasis that I was trying to make during this presentation is that we really are limited with resources. So looking at your rural emergency management agencies, they don't have a lot of stuff. They don't have a lot of people to work the incident. They don't have a lot of resources with trucks or supplies or other things like that. So, your suburban emergency management agency can probably help the little guy a lot better by making partnerships and doing mutual aid and doing stuff like that. But I mean, collaboration is key, really, ultimately. Felix, do you have anything to add?
Well, I would say that's a definite factor, but you have to realize that the suburban agency, in our case, is 45 miles away. Our nearest group is 10 miles away, and they're just like we are. It's a small community. So when you're 40 to 50 miles removed from the large metropolitan area and the big time resources that they have, they are reluctant to roll them out until the last minute because they're needed at home, and two, it becomes a cost issue for them to get them to you, both timing, manpower, and equipment. So there's a lot of play there in that. Also, one of the things you didn't mention, a lot of the EMs in my world, are the rural EMs, are volunteer. So, you call the office and it may or may not get answered. It may forward to their cell phone, and they may be off hauling hay or running cattle. And yep, they're the EM, but that's just another thing they do in the community. So we don't all have the luxury of having full-time emergency managers, myself included. I mean, it's one of those things that if it's not a labor of love, it's not going to happen.
Great answer. Todd, do you have any questions for the panel?
I was going to ask Mike if so you presented some data from Maricopa County, which is a treasure trove of information down there in Phoenix. But have we had any case studies or some even anecdotal evidence of colder climates, like say western region like Seattle or along the coast, where you tend to have a lot of cool conditions, but of course heat is still a factor when it does pop up. albeit at a much lower temperature usually. So has there been any type of information that's flowed to you on heat risk and its usefulness in those situations too as well?
Nothing in a quantitative sense, but certainly qualitative. It certainly has been. Again, the issues with colder climates is they have much fewer numbers when it comes to the number of impacts in terms of the flashy things like mortality, especially. Morbidity kind of statistics are very hit and miss. Some hospitals have them, some don't. OSHA requirements mean that you can't really access them. So the CDC really is the only place that you get that kind of data from. So the only quantitative values I have are the fact that we found pretty good statistical relationships for almost all of the Western region offices when it comes to the values that they provided me when it came to the threshold values. And we'll be incorporating those into version 2.0 even more robustly. And in the cooler climates, what we're finding is the values have dropped. So the red levels are even lower. And again, it's going to shock us. It's going to shock us how low they are, but I don't think we appreciate sometimes just how low the values can be for when heat impacts. I think we're used to Vegas and Phoenix, being really high numbers, but in places that don't get a lot of heat, those values are pretty low because that population hasn't really been acclimated to, a 90-degree day, let's say in Seattle.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
We had another question come in from Mike. There has been growing popularity for wet bulb globe temperature as a means for forecasting and measuring heat impacts. Have you looked at that methodology and compared your heat risk and that methodology's pros and cons?
So yeah, there's three main heat approaches, I think, in the United States that the National Weather Service is currently looking at. Wet bulb globe temperature is one of them. Heat index is obviously the traditional methodology, and then heat risk is the third method that they're currently looking at. And each one of them provides a different approach to the elephant, so to speak. So, not one of them captures exactly what you're looking for. Wet bulb globe temperature is really good for the active person who is strenuously doing something out in the outdoors. That is a subset of the population, and it certainly would not help with the Chicago heat wave event where hundreds of people died over the course of a couple of days. It doesn't help with, the Pacific Northwest heat, that's an acclimation of heat in a place, in a building that doesn't get air conditioning, and things like that. So heat index works in some places, it doesn't work in others. So heat risk, what we're trying to do is find something that we can forecast really easily that doesn't have 7 degrees of freedom. And that's the challenge with wet bulb globe temperature is you have to have cloud cover forecast accurately. You have to have winds forecast accurately. You have to have dew point forecast accurately, all the way up through 7 days if you want that kind of a formulation. And you need a climatology for it to put into this framework. And we don't have, a lot of stations that have that kind of data in that granular methodology. So we went the other way, which said temperature is the first order driver for heat. We have co-op stations and raw stations and all kinds of supplemental stations we can leverage to give us more local flavor of what the heat looks like. And so let's leverage all that and the fact that we forecast temperatures really, really well in a National Weather Service out through 7 days. It's the one element we do really well on. And let's create a heat service around that. So wet bulb globe temperature for someone who's planning their athletic program, the military, again, people that are engaged in outdoor activities. I think that's a great supplemental source for heat information for those particular folks that need heat index and have thresholds based on heat index. Go crazy, heat index is available as well. We're looking for something that we can use kind of across the entire country and it has more of a broader base applicability rather than being really focused in on a particular user group.
Great answer. And I have one final question, and that's actually for Chris. If in a perfect world, all MLB teams had a lightning plan established, who would be the decision makers for that? A meteorologist on site, or would the teams do this on their own?
It's a really good question. And, there are teams that do have meteorologists on staff, and I think that is probably the best case scenario. I think Felix had mentioned in their presentation, you have a storm that's moving 10 miles an hour versus a storm that's moving 50 miles an hour. It's a very different situation in the distance and the time that you need to get people to safety. So I think if you have meteorologists on staff that's actually monitoring the situation, they can adapt the lightning safety threshold as necessary for whether it's a squall line that's moving through the Chicago area or the pop-up thunderstorms that are going to impact Tampa Bay or Miami.
Adapt the threshold. Good phrase. With that being said, Todd, do you have any closing remarks for the membership?
Just to thank our presenters for taking the time out of their busy schedules for presenting in a little bit more detail what they had done at the annual meeting. And I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that one of the more difficult tasks I had to do in this exercise was to pick just 3. There are so many good poster presentations in our NWA annual meeting. And just as a reminder to all of our attendees and people that are listening to the recordings afterwards, that all these presentations are available from the annual meeting through the Whova app, and then later they'll be ported over to our member clicks system within NWA. And so they're going to be available. I invite you all, if you haven't already, to go through that, watch them, and feel free to contact the presenters of those if you have further questions. So it's a treasure trove of information, and hopefully we'll get to do this again soon sometime. And thanks to the NWA webinar crew too as well for putting this on and all the webinars every month. They do a fantastic job. So thank all of you as well.
Well, we want to be able to thank you as well to our host, Todd Laricos, the president, as well as our speakers, Chris Bagaski, Ashley Morris, Felix Nance, and Michael Stoddenmeyer, and to everybody for attending. Thank you also to the social media committee member, Trevor Boucher, for live tweeting during the presentation. Stay tuned to the social media as well as the website for information on our next webinar. Thanks again, and see you next time.